Remarkable Republican here to bring you the truth with a truth-flavored bias. Today I'd like to talk about Jim Cornette and his relationship with Vince Russo. I've been listening to a lot of wrestling podcasts lately, and it's become very clear to me that something is askew with the story that Jim Cornette tells, and a lot of people don't realize it because they haven't looked at what Vince Russo has said about the situation. But when you combine what both men have said, it is clear that the origin of their beef with one another is a homosexual relationship that didn't work out. So let's go through the evidence. Cornette was a really good wrestling manager and he's a good speaker, but he has some serious personality defects. He's a fat glutton who's obsessed with Wendy's cheeseburgers, and that in itself is a sign of limited character, a lack of wisdom, and it can also denote some relatively evil characteristics. After all, many of the greatest villains in both history and in fiction have been gluttons. There are two major issues with Jim Cornette as a person. First is political. Cornette is a deadhead Democrat, and he really hates our president and our flag for reasons that don't make any sense at all. But there's no point in addressing that. I'm really just going to talk about his problems with Vince Russo. When it comes to his politics, I just would rather see him melt down in 2020 when Trump wins an even bigger electoral victory than he won in 2016. And another thing about Cornette is hopefully after I expose his character and the nature of his dispute with Russo, it will undermine his credibility as a political analyst, because a lot of people treat Jim Cornette like he is a real expert, like he's on the level of a Wolf Blitzer or a Bill O'Reilly, and he just isn't there. Now, what Cornette does is he constantly harps on Vince Russo, who's an accomplished wrestling writer, a good man who has found God, he has a family, and he's trying to move on with his life. And also, not to bring it up too much, I said we're already going to move on, but still, it's worth saying one more time, Vince Russo actually does understand American politics, unlike Jim Cornette. But aside from just being a hater, it is also clear that there's a lot more to this story and that it deals with a lot more than just wrestling. Cornette claims that he hates Russo because of wrestling disagreements, but Cornette is actually more passionate about cheeseburgers and politics than wrestling. Now, obviously, he has plenty of passion for wrestling, but I think it's clear that he cares about cheeseburgers a little bit more. Just look at him. Cornette also tells us, and this is key evidence, that they initially got along well, rode together, and they had sort of a Kentucky-New York dynamic where they would each sort of tease the other one about where they're from and all that kind of stuff. And it sounds like an odd couple because it is. This is the explanation of how a gay homosexual spark was born between these two men, and how they had a romance in a Motel 6 or a Super 8 or whatever it was at the time, and this took them across the U.S., and this must have lasted for several months. Obviously, Cornette says that for the first several months they got along pretty well. The fallout happened because their love fell out, and the reason is because both of these guys are bisexual rather than strictly homosexual. The competition also for McMahon's favor, only one of them could win, only one of them could be right in the eyes of the boss, so that created some friction, and a lot of workplace relationships will fall apart if the two people are competing for power and influence. They had meetings at McMahon's house where this rivalry would be on display openly, and Russo would pitch ideas while Cornette listened, and Cornette said that he was deeply depressed during this time because he left Smoky Mountain Wrestling, but the reason why he was really depressed is because he was in the room with his man that he still wanted, and he couldn't have him because Russo had gone back hetero, and Cornette was really depressed to be there. He said that at that time he was eating more cheeseburgers than normal, and he hated himself, and he claims it's because he thought Russo's ideas were stupid, but again, Russo created the Attitude Era, which was the most successful period of wrestling. And then we hear that that Cornette had a deep sense of betrayal when Russo went to WCW Not to mention, he also felt deeply aggrieved that Vince Russo was obsessed with Sable. Sable was a female wrestler who was known for being very attractive, and Vince Russo would fantasize about her wearing cotton panties, apparently, and Cornette finds that ridiculous, and he doesn't understand it. But the thing is, like, if you look at Sable, it's pretty hard to think that anyone who wouldn't get what Russo was talking about could possibly be a heterosexual. So if anything, on the scale of bisexuality, Cornette is probably about 75% homo, and Russo is probably only about 25% homo. The two men reunited in TNA. Also, apparently Russo had something to do with the name TNA because it sounds like titties and ass, but it stands for Total Nonstop Action. Cornette didn't like the name because he's not really all that into titties and ass. Russo, anyway, for Russo, a lot of this was trying to distance himself from the past, right? He's trying to distance himself from his homosexual encounter with Cornette, and one way to do that is overt displays of heterosexuality, like talking about titties and ass. And also another factor is that this obsession with Russo and titties and ass, this also points out to Jim Cornette once again that he and Russo are not together, and this is another source of annoyance. Since that time, also Russo helped get Cornette fired because he didn't want to be tempted back into gay stuff. Anyway, since then, Russo has turned his life around. He's found God. And like a lot of people who become very religious later in life, a lot of people are making up for either drug use or some sort of homosexual encounter. And I think in Russo's case, there's clear evidence that he had a brief relationship with Cornette and that he's trying to make up for it now and get right with God. And good for him. Like, Russo lives a really good, clean life and, has a great podcast and all that. Cornette is an avowed atheist, the default homosexual religious conviction, and he is angry at Russo for taking up his faith because he knows that Russo's faith is a barrier to their homosexual relationship. Cornette also has violent tendencies, which that kind of temper is also a symptom of gay homosexuality. And since he can't have Russo, he wants to make sure that no one else has him either, so he bashes him all the time, diminishes his record and his achievements, won't acknowledge that he was the father of the Attitude Era, and threatens violence. So the idea, probably subconsciously, that Cornette has is that what he'll do is drive down the market value on Russo, and then when Russo's at his lowest point, reconcile with him and resume their homosexual relationship. And the thing to remember is that Russo made some mistakes, but he was also a brilliant creative mind whose main mistake was having an evening or several evenings of passion with Jim Cornette. Cornette's attacks on Russo are petty and personal, and they're just as dumb as his criticism of President Trump. There's no basis for his visceral hatred of Russo, and it all stems from just being a spurned lover. If there's no scorn like that if there's no hate like that of a woman scorned, then I guess no one had met Jim Cornette when they made that phrase. Anyway, that's all I've got to say. This has been Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a true-flavored bias, and I'll be back in the future with more videos on important topics, exposing hacks and other people who are not worthy of the airtime that they receive.